Curse: The Eye of Isis is a third-person survival horror game set in Victorian London where you play as Dr. Darian Dane and Emily Sutton as they try to prevent a cataclysmic event brought about by a cursed Egyptian idol. The game is available on Steam, GOG, Original Xbox, and PlayStation 2. Atmosphere. The game has 4 major environments: the museum, the sewers below the museum, the steamboat, and the pyramid. And most of these environments have a foundation of just being dark and spooky with fixed camera angles, lighting, the constant hum, and the occasional music piece to fill the air with suspense. Though there are smaller things that contribute as well, like the museum's exhibits, where you'll walk into a torture chamber or find some weird stuffed animals. The sewers have claustrophobic, narrow corridors, and the pyramid's many ancient murals and creepy tombs keep the atmosphere going. Some areas feel far more intense than others, but the background atmosphere really comes and goes. Sections like the steamboat seemingly had nothing in the way of atmosphere, with the music and ambience being largely absent for the duration of that chapter, which led to the whole section feeling fairly dull. The game is short but still had backtracking, which really wanes on the atmosphere even more, especially in the museum at the start. The map doesn't move or have labels, so it's hard to tell where you're meant to go through the vast maze of empty corridors, which, even with the game's electric feeling, doesn't hold up over extended periods of aimless walking. This was made even worse on the steamboat since there's no atmosphere at all. The game was trying sometimes with its atmosphere, but having no music in the boat section at all really made that chapter stand out as especially boring, and the rest of the game was questionable. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. Curse: Eye of Isis dishes out its scares mostly with its combat, which is often signalled by a random stab of music and the fact that enemies are sometimes waiting when you walk around the corner or smash through a door to surprise you, which can be a little startling. But unfortunately, these things do nothing to really aid the fear factor of dealing with the enemies. The game's pool of foes was very shallow, with only 3 or 4 different types of enemies in the whole game, and whilst the major takeaway was that the mysterious yellow fog can seep into them and bring them back to life, they weren't any harder to defeat once they were possessed. The fog itself was poisonous, but certain enemies dropped items that not only cured the poison completely, but also healed you for far higher than I would have anticipated. This, combined with general enemy damage, which seemed very low, made the combat seem easy throughout, with only the boss fights proving to be a challenge through having weird mechanics to them. The game gave so much ammo that inventory space became a problem, but even if you had no ammo, the melee weapons worked on everything but the bosses and were sometimes higher damage than the guns. On top of their damage being weak, the general enemies had a hard time hitting you, with it being very possible to just walk down a corridor towards a generic henchman and have them totally miss you several times with a shotgun. Basically, the combat was never a problem, and made certain enemies seem more incompetent than deadly. There really wasn't much in the way of scares besides some creepy cutscenes, but even some of them didn't really hit the mark consistently, with some of them feeling like not enough time was put into them, and they seemed pretty janky. The game could have done a lot better than it did, with more challenging combat, better enemy placement, more enemy types, and various balancing adjustments. The combat could have made the game feel more like a survival horror game than what we actually got. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. Like the atmosphere, the music was sometimes present and sometimes absent. The museum had a plethora of dark, tuneless ambient pieces, but also some surprisingly creepy tracks, with one being nothing more than a repeating upwards tone that's sort of hard to describe, but it gave certain moments like walking down a corridor in the museum basement this feeling of suspense that led you to believe that something would happen.
Mr. Darien Dane.
The steamboat section seemed to have no music at all and just relied on the sounds of the boat, which was odd and made the boat the least atmospheric and most boring part of the game. Eye of Isis also had the strange habit of using a lot of incidental stabs and other things to emphasize moments. These came across as cheesy more often than not and didn't really help the way they seemed to be designed to, barely having an impact and in some points just seeming totally unnecessary. Sound effects used in the games were not especially incredible, but not bad either, but things like enemies yelling were repeated so much that if you used a flamethrower, the sound clip could interrupt itself to play more often, which made the combat even less threatening. The game's voice acting was actually very good, with again some pretty cheesy performances, but it was still fun to listen to the different exaggerated accents.
That's where they kept that statue. I always knew it was bad luck bringing it here. I need to sit down.
Overall, the sound design was underwhelming. There wasn't much in the way of reverb. The music was okay, but either didn't fit or wasn't played. The only thing that really excelled was the voice acting, and the rest of it just felt fairly lazy. That's still no Harry Masons. Gore. There wasn't much gore in the game, besides some blood clouds when enemies were shot or hit, the ripped open corpses of the possessed enemies where you could see their yellowed internal organs, and there's a body in the torture chamber, but that's about it. It didn't really feel like more blood was necessary to improve things either, with what was in the game matching the tone of the setting. That's one Harry Mason. Story. The story begins with Dr. Darien Dane and Emily Sutton, two Egyptian artefact enthusiasts who end up wrapped up in a plot to steal the Eye of Isis, a recent acquisition into the museum and target of a shady thief and a gang of thugs. The story isn't incredible, and there are several moments where it becomes fairly predictable and almost funny, with the two playable characters bailing each other out like clockwork to seemingly justify having two playable characters. The game felt like a wild goose chase to catch up to the thief who stole the artifact that's leaving a trail of curse-laden zombies in their wake. But even when characters who seem like they would make the plot interesting, like Bupo, a stereotypical evil artifact hunter, who seemed destined to be the game's real antagonist, only appeared for a single chapter and then was never seen again. There's a plot twist near the end and some diary entries too to make up for some fun reading, but the story wasn't very original. The plot had random events and holes in it, and things that it did to make up for it didn't quite achieve that goal, making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. Curse the Eye of Isis is, to put it politely, not a great horror game. It lacks thoroughly in originality, and the atmosphere, which would have been its greatest strength, is something that only seeps in now and then. The combat and resource management is too easy to really call it a survival horror, but for the current game's price of just £2 on Steam, it's hard to complain. I know a low score seems indicative of a bad game, but I only rate the horror elements. Curse Eye of Isis isn't unfunctional, terrible in design, or ostensibly bad, it's just not very good with its horror. Again, I'd like to remind you, the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I retrieved the Eye of Isis, I did not give up on Abdul, and you shouldn't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.